and you're all very welcome to our special webinar this morning to mark the official launch of our Slack channel activities. My name is Martina Fitzgerald, and I'm the CEO of Scale Ireland, which represents, supports, and advocates on behalf of Ireland's tech startup and scale-up companies. And there are currently 2,000 companies around the country employing 47,000 people. And of course, for every one startup job, 5 more are created in the community. So it's a very dynamic sector with huge potential in terms of employment, exports, and of course, innovation. Now, back in 2019, Liz McCarthy came together with Brian Caulfield and also Patrick Walsh of Dogpatch Labs, which is hosting us here today. And they decided to set up Scale Ireland. Why? Well, they decided that startups and founders needed a voice to highlight their particular issues and also the opportunities in relation to this sector. And we're now beginning a new and exciting phase of Scale Ireland's development. We're commissioning key research on a number of issues, including share options to help startups to recruit and to retain staff. We're also advocating on behalf of early stage startups who are often struggling to attract private investment. We're also involved in a number of key EU initiatives to help startups thrive across Europe. And of course, we're collaborating with a number of universities to identify key issues and to commission research in these areas. So it's an exciting time, but at the core of all our activities are founders and startups. And that's why our Slack channel is so important to us. And today is an important milestone. We're officially launching our Slack channel activities in collaboration with our partner Stripe. Now, who better to host today's event than, of course, our head of marketing and community, Rynne Cullen, because Luke has been instrumental in building up that community. So without further ado, I'm going to go off stage and leave it to Luke. Luke.
Thanks, Martina. I'm delighted to host today's event to really mark the launch of our Slack activities. Since late 2019, we've been working extraordinarily hard to build a community that really rallies behind the ethos of Give First. Our community is engaging in peer-to-peer mentorship, sharing of resources, and weekly networking to really get veteran entrepreneurs to give experience to those up and coming in the ecosystem. So a big thank you to everyone that's participating in the channel, all our volunteers, those who set up the channel in the first place, all our many advisors that are coming on board to run Ask Me Anything sessions and give advice to the sector. There's no place better than Dogpatch Labs to be hosting today's event. State-of-the-art facilities and an incredible team, which makes running events like this an absolute dream. And I'm delighted to introduce Mark Barry. Mark has over 20 years experience. He is the head of startups and SMBs over at Stripe, and we're incredibly lucky to have him here for today's session on go-to-market strategies. The format for today's event will be a presentation from Mark, which will be followed by a panel discussion with Liz Fulham, CEO of SalesOptimize, a global leader in market intelligence software, and our very own Brian Caulfield, chairperson of Scale Ireland. So thank you very much, and over to you, Mark.
Thank you. Good morning, and thank you very much for having me today. I'm delighted to share some perspectives on go-to-market strategy, some of the things I've learned from my career in sales and product roles, and also from hundreds of conversations that I have with people every day about developing go-to-market strategies. And so there are, of course, frameworks and strategies and things that you can use. But before we get into those, really important to bear in mind some key aspects. Your customers will shape your strategy, and at least at the start, determine it. The clue is in the term itself. You need to go to the market to understand what the market wants and how it wants to consume it. And speaking of it, your go-to-market strategy starts with your product. In fact, products and go-to-market strategy are inextricably linked at the beginning and remain that way through the lifetime of the product. You should expect your go-to-market strategy to evolve, adapting to changes not only in market, but by your own design as you scale the company and iterate on the solution. And there are some well-worn and useful frameworks for deciding on aspects of go-to-market strategy. And the level of sophistication you employ will depend largely on the stage of your business. Whichever framework you go by, you will certainly need to get some handle on your customer. Who are they? Your offering. What is it and how do you tell the story? Your channel to market. How did they get it? And what success looks like. Did you win? But let's talk briefly about product market fit. Importantly, the first go-to-market employee at your startup is you, the founder. This is obviously the case. You'll pitch to your co-founder. You might pitch to a partner or family member to back you in taking a risk. You'll pitch to your first investors and distribution partners. You'll pitch to your first employees. I recommend being involved in that process for as long as it scales. And at the start, you should figure out what's the best way to do business with a prospective customer. When are they most responsive to my questions? What do they expect from me? Probably nothing at the start. Or my product, also probably nothing very much until you prove some value. Invariably, you'll need to be extremely close to your first customers. If your business is B2B, that's probably your first 5 users. If it's B2C, more like 50 until you find some degree of product market fit. This is all about discovery and validation, identifying a need, pivoting, all in the pursuit of product market fit. And core to understanding product market fit includes determining how your product is best distributed. Is it a self-serve product? And if so, what skills does a prospective user need to use it? Or is it a complex managed sales process? Stripe is a B2B self-serve product, offering a range of low-code or no-code options that allow anyone to play. Of course, some prospective users may have more complex needs, some of which might even ladder up to new product ideas if we hear them enough times. And that's why we have a sales team. Predominantly though, Stripe users, like Google AdWords users and AWS users, can get started by themselves. The product, in a way, is the go-to-market strategy. These are all B2B examples, and while B2C, by its nature, could address a much larger contingent of prospective users, for example, something like Clubhouse or Buy Me, not every B2C business can be self-served. If you're selling kitchens, you can and should aim to really make the design and even the purchase process as simple as possible. But ultimately, someone has to install the kitchen. Going back to the example of Buy Me for a second, go-to-market becomes more complex when serving a multi-sided market, in this case, B to B to C. Here, you need to understand what everyone in the value chain wants and how they want it to be delivered. No pun intended. You can think of your product strategy, your product distribution strategy as a triangle. Is your product predominantly self-serve? Maybe it's original, unique, or disruptive. For example, the self-servability is the product. Or does the sale need to be supported by humans? Maybe it's a substitute for an existing product or service, a displacement sell. I've used the triangle as a proxy for org design, but it could also be applied to mindshare. So is your business a self-serve business? And is the self-servability something that you deliver or determine as the product? Or is it more sales-led? With self-serve, you really want to focus on the product experience and also how your users interact with the product. It will be really important for you to install great support in a self-serve business. The product will be the first way to do that. But your first customer success people should really be as close a representation of you as possible. With low self-servability, you'll need to do much more to generate demand and support prospective users through a sales and onboarding process. The complexity of the product or the degree of customization required for every user integration will determine the kinds of skills you need in your go-to-market function. And so, for example, marketing, outbound demand generation, pre-sales support, post-sales implementation support, or ongoing technical support. Unsurprisingly, this is typically the preserve of startups that intend to go after very large customers, which not only have complex needs, but where the deal pays for the headcount investment at your end, at least over time. At the start, you'll know your users by name. And assuming you make it past the first handful of users, the next set are likely going to hear about you from your first set of users. Word of mouth, the company you keep, and the circles you move within are your users. Finding your next set of users will be manual at the start. You should be thinking, who else could use this? Or will my happy customers refer me to their circle? Marketing, promotion, and demand generation all come from you. Your marketing budget at the start can be measured in hours, yours, as you create interesting content for social media, as you write up what your users have found about your product, and even as you ask for more feedback. Your decisions around the big things will at the start be based largely on qualitative signals and feedback. But as you scale and amass more information programmatically, data is your best source of reliable information. A question I like to ask founders is, what information do you need to decide which market to go to next? It's not only an important exercise to test yourself on your own awareness of your business, but in order to answer the question well, you're likely going to have to draw on lots of resources and lots of sources of data. Without prior experience of a market, it would be really difficult to intuit a decision on navigating regulatory complexity, or deciding on how consumers will interact with your product, or even on knowing who the best candidates are to help you grow locally. Think about how you assess the performance of your business. How do you know you're winning? Maybe it's active users, revenue, marquee logos, retention. In the beginning, think about what's most important to your success. It's likely to be related to acquiring customers, having them use your product, and keeping them. With your go-to-market teams, start broad. Think about go get more customers, or try and crack this particular segment, or try and find users that look like these other users. Don't start with performance management, and be prepared to pivot and optimize as you go. Make sure your goals are broad, but not so broad that they're not measurable. They need to be measured, and as you measure them, course correct if something is going wrong. Culture is not a pool table and free food, and while those things often come with the territory and become more important as you scale and give away less of your equity, they shouldn't be the focus of you or your founding team. Instead, your culture should be shaped by your mission and by your purpose, for example, increasing the GDP of the internet. There are a couple of key considerations when scaling, and how well you make decisions at this point have a direct and profound impact on your culture. Your first hires are the foundation of your culture. Their values and ways of working will set the tone for the company as it scales, and you should be extremely deliberate in choosing the right people for your company and actively avoid hiring people whose character flaws could either hurt your culture over the long run, or worse, could expose you to more dramatic or public outcomes. If your company has its foundation in technology, hire great technologists. When you start to think about your first business hires, be extremely thoughtful in that process too. It's very possible to avoid splitting the company into tech and business factions, and it's really important that you do so. Your first GTM team members should be passionate about your mission and your product, and they should be passionate about the problems you're trying to solve. If they're not, your prospective customers will spot that, and you will fail to make the right connections with those users. Keep your teams together. Have them sit next to each other. Remove barriers to conversation. Open workspaces work great for this, but make space for quiet time or confidential conversations too. Your go-to-market teams should feel excited about the product and the progress being made on it, and your technical teams should feel confident and well represented in the field. To keep you on track, be explicit about how you want to get there. Establish some guidelines or guardrails or operating principles. These are more explicit statements about how you want to build your company. For example, focusing on users first. You should expect to refine these operating principles as you scale, and you should be clear about why that is. Over time, you'll begin to identify characteristics among team members that are not only great to have, but are durable to change. So in summary, talk to your customers and talk to them about product market fit, and be prepared to find the best way to reach your customers and for that to evolve over time. Think about the shape of your organization and how it affects your distribution strategy. Is it self-serve or is it sales-led? Leverage your network. Ask them for referrals And don't be afraid to promote the business yourself. This is your business. Set clear, big, and unambiguous goals. Measure them and learn from your mistakes, and avoid optimizing too early. And with culture, be really clear and explicit about your mission and values, and have some operating principles or guidelines in place to bring you through that. Make it easy to collaborate and build collaboration into how you get work done, and expect your culture to evolve. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. Great presentation, covered many of the topics that I think all founders experience when they're setting out on their journey. I myself have learned an awful lot actually from that presentation. So I'd like to bring in our panel to discuss some of the key topics covered and get their perspective on things. So Liz, Mark touched a lot on the structure and building the right distribution process for your startup. From your experience, what has worked for you and perhaps your customers as well over at SalesOptimize?
Absolutely. So at SalesOptimize, we do market intelligence and sales lead generation. I think Mark's points are very, very true and relevant. So we actually target more into the enterprise space. So what we find is that we're hunters of our market rather than farmers. So a hunter is somebody that has like an outbound sales team. They reach out and connect to their customers. They have a lot of work to do on the pre-sales, the product market fit, the post-sales, and the customer success. Whereas our price point starts at about 12,000 upwards. Some of our clients are over 100,000 in annual fees. Whereas when you're really a farmer, and that tends to be more the B2C, your average price point is probably less than $50 a month. And therefore, it's much more about getting people to come to your website and promoting your website. Whereas with us, nobody really comes inbound and wants to spend 12,000 or 100,000. They do, you might be exceptional and find the golden nugget. But by definition, what we tend to find is a lot of what we have to do in the enterprise space is reach out, connect, and explain our proposition and why we can help companies grow their sales.
Brilliant. And Brian, Mark said that founders are the first people to kind of do the sales. And I think LearnUpon's founder in a Dogpatch Labs event also mentioned that. So I think, what do you see as the key traits of a founder in terms of them knowing their stuff, especially when they're going to raise investment? What tells you that they know their sales strategy inside out?
Well, I think the first thing is that Mark's absolutely right. Every kind of founder, CEO is actually chief sales officer, especially in the early days of a business. So the ability to sell is a kind of an absolutely crucial component of the makeup of, as I say, especially an early stage founder. And I'd encourage, one of the best things I ever did in my career was actually do some sales training. I think that's something that's an incredibly useful thing for a founder to do. And I think Mark made a really great point that, even if your market opportunity is very much a product-led market, as a founder CEO, you're always in the business of persuasion. You're persuading that next great hire to join the company. You're persuading that investor that you've got a fantastic market opportunity and a unique insight into that market opportunity. So you're literally always in the business of persuasion. To turn to your question about investors, I think what investors really, really like to see in a founder is that they know their market, but that they have a unique insight into the market. It's really, really great when you hear a founder speak about the market opportunity they're targeting and tell you how everybody else is getting it wrong and what their unique insight is that's going to enable them to succeed. And that's very, very compelling to an investor, because it's not just convincing them that there is a large market opportunity, but also that you've got a differentiated approach to that market opportunity.
And Mark, you mentioned culture and how important it is to build a multidisciplinary team.
Yeah.
When you've convinced the investors and your customers and you're showing signs of product market fit, what does the composition of that team look like, and how do you onboard them to make sure they're set up for success?
It's a great question. I think it largely depends on what it is that you're trying to achieve. I think actually, the founder asked me recently as well. They're building this really quite industry specific product, which is really quite disruptive. It's a traditional industry, and the question from them, there are maybe 4 or 5 people in the company right now. The question was, do I go after this, this specialism, this person with this, particular trade experience, 20 or 30 years of experience, and try and bring them to the organization right now? I think, to be honest with you, it's a question that doesn't have a universal answer. The things that I would take into consideration when thinking about like, where is the next, few euros of my budget or my investment going to go in hiring? Think about the thing that's going to get you to your next step quickest, right? And so, for example, in that case, what that person was trying to do was build credibility around what is quite a traditional business being disrupted by having a kind of a name, if you like, and bringing credibility and referenceability into the team. That might very well be exactly what's needed for them to go and find the next 10 or 15 or 20 users. What I think is really important, though, is that you set the right expectations with that person as they're joining the team. One of the great things about experience is you get lots of experience. One of the downsides of experience is sometimes that experience can be institutionalized or can be hard to shift, or might not be ready for the pace, and their expectations may be different to yours. So I think whatever you decide to do, you need to be clear on what that is. I think one other point as well, which is really important, is as you scale, it's never too soon to think about the kind of diversity within your team. Because what is diversity is not just kind of like a token thing to say. I mean, there's a purpose behind building diverse teams, which is to have a more close representation of the world at large, or of your customers at large as well. And so I think whatever you decide to do, try and avoid only hiring people that look and sound and act like you. I don't know who coined the phrase, but there's a famous expression like, if 2 people are always agreeing, one of them is redundant.
Very true, very true. And Liz, to kind of tie in with that in making kind of data-driven decisions, what has been the kind of key objectives, key results that you might set out in your startup to ensure that your team are achieving their goals?
So I was fortunate, just to follow on from Mark said, I only worked in Fortune 500 companies before my startup. And I think the big thing that I found is a lot of people are saying, hire people from these big Fortune 500 companies to help you. But in reality, that's not a great answer, because you definitely have to get people who want to roll up their sleeves and do the work themselves. And a lot of people coming out of big companies have managed other people to do the work. They haven't necessarily done the work themselves. And what you really need to do is hire really smart, young, talented, gifted people who have a passion for your company. So back to the data-driven question, the one thing is we use data. Obviously, we consume a high volume of data. What we do is we use the data in the sales team. So we segment our market down exactly into who we're targeting and by which geography. So we've globalized our product around the world, with the exception of Russia and China. And we use the data that we use in our own technology to say, how big is our market opportunity for us? Who are we targeting? And what is unique that we're giving them that no other data provider can give them? So, for example, we won some really massive, big payment companies because we could show them a list of each other's customers, and we could actually show them what payment processor they're using and what payment method they're using, what technology they're built on. And this was hugely attractive, and Mark would know how appealing that would be for a company like Stripe, for example. We've also used data, for example, to measure the performance of people, because sales is a numbers game. And I agree with Brian is saying, I love sales and I'm the top salesperson in the company because I believe I have to sell. Everybody in my team has to sell. So we measure all of the predictive indicators. Like, what's a predictive indicator in sales is like, how big is their sales pipeline? What's the average value of the ticket they're trying to sell to? All the predictive indicators like demos booked, trials done, etc. And not just the volume indicators, which is revenue that you book. And I think it's really important to understand the predictive indicators, the KPIs, as well as the results, because if you're controlling the predictive indicators, the results will follow. But if you're only asking the guys, well, who did you win today, and having beautiful conversations, and you're not data driven, you're just spinning in stories, but you're actually not driving money into the bank. And all investors want to see money in the bank.
Brilliant. And Brian, I suppose tying on with that, what are the key kind of metrics that you use to gauge a startup's health in terms of, is it the customer lifetime value, average contract value, or even the cost of acquisition per lead?
Well, there's a variety of different metrics, but I think Mark made a really important point about kind of not optimizing too early. And I think one of the things to remember about data-driven decisions is that you can only make data-driven decisions if you've got data, right? And a lot of very early stage companies simply don't have data, you know? So I think at the very start, what you need to be doing as a company is very much operating on a lean basis. And I mean lean in the sense of, you know, thinking of your startup as a series of experiments. So at that stage, from a go-to-market perspective, I don't want to see companies just, you know, blindly throwing shit at the wall, you know. I want the company to have a theory, you know, here's what we think about the type of customer that's going to be that's going to be interested in our product, and kind of testing that theory in the market. As they develop, they need to constantly sharpen their focus and have an increasingly clear picture of exactly what the perfect customer looks like. And as that evolves, metrics start to become incredibly important. You know, the kind of metrics that we'd be looking at as investors is absolutely the cost of acquisition, and importantly, the ratio between the cost of acquisition and the lifetime value of the customer. You know, typically what we'd like to see is that you can recover your cost of acquisition within a year, ideally. But if you've got a very long lifetime value for the customer and you can demonstrate that, then, you know, a longer period to recover your cost of acquisition might be justified. The other thing that we'd like to see early on for a company that's kind of starting to scale is, firstly, ideally month-on-month growth and reduction, gradual reduction in the cost of acquisition, because that tells you that a company is at the point where it understands its sales process and it's starting to optimize the sales process, you know. And it's always great if you see a company that can tell you, this is what our cost of acquisition is today, and we think if we do X and Y, we can get it to, you know, that minus 20% or whatever it is. But I think Mark's caution is really important there. You know, don't try to optimize too early, because apart from anything else, you just don't have the data to enable you to optimize. If you've got one customer or two customers, you don't know what the cost of acquisition is. That's, you know, that's the fundamental, you know.
Very true. And then Mark, how do you kind of size up an international opportunity? How do you pick which market to go into next? What kind of best practices would you look out for and set up to know?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's again something that I talk to founders about quite often, you know, who might say, hey, you know, we're looking to expand into this market or that market. And the question that I would ask them, but the same question that we would ask ourselves, let's say if we're going to a new market, is why? What is it that's drawing us into that market? I think, you know, when you get to a degree of scale where you're already contemplating new markets, And again, let's maybe put a little bit of context around the market. Market could be a new geography, like an entirely new country. It could also be a nearby city, or a new market actually could be another segment that you're serving with your product, that you could serve with your product that you're not serving today. I think what's really key is that if you know that you're already ready to contemplate new markets, then you have amassed some degree of data and insight into the performance of the business thus far. You're not like at the stage where you're abandoning one market to go, maybe you are, but abandoning one market to go to the next. Usually the kind of signals that you'll want are the pull factors. So is the market in that geography or territory or whatever pulling our business towards them? Are we getting lots of inbound inquiry? Are we getting, searches? Are we getting traffic on our site on particular pages, or inquiries wondering when we're going to go there? The other thing is is there competition in that market already where we could compete, quite credibly or even better than what's available there now? Is there an appetite among consumers for us to be there? Again, if you're let's say a disruptive technology like a food delivery service or a ride sharing service or something like that, you really need to understand the consumers. You need to understand, the disposable income. You need to get down to the level of what's the broadband like if my product is delivered through an app. Do people have smartphones, and so you can really get quite granular. But I think the pull factors are: is there an addressable market? Is there a reasonable way for us to get to a point where we are making revenue or profitable or whatever it might be? There may be other pull factors too, which are customers in some markets want you to be in other markets, and so that's a high class problem, I think, to have. I think one thing that some folks neglect to consider is, like, what are the reasons not to go into another market? And some of those could be regulatory complexity. They could be the competition is too stiff. It could be the cost of distribution is too high, or the cost of talent is too high. And so it's important not just to think about what's drawing me there, but think about some of the reasons why you also wouldn't do that.
And following on from that, do you think the playing field has been somewhat leveled in that everyone's doing remote sales processes at the moment? Can startups from very regional locations be able to compete with those that are in more centralized locations?
Absolutely. I think even for businesses like ours, where, we have teams located, around Europe, also, globally in offices there. But what we found actually is how receptive our customers and prospective customers are to working remotely. Not by choice for many, of course, because this is the situation we find ourselves in. But I believe that the way of doing business has changed irreversibly, in many ways, I think, for the better, but I think it has certainly changed. And so that really, really does level the playing field. I sometimes think about remote working. We are all in a state of remote working now because of a global pandemic. I sometimes think about what it would have been like had this happened 5 years ago or 10 years ago, where Zoom calls were not a thing, where broadband availability was not great. Whole countries or whole regions, let's say cities around Ireland, for example, would have been more or less disconnected from their market. And so now there's never a better time than now, actually, to take advantage of remote possibilities. And I think, to the question of the regions, we're seeing this already. There are companies investing really quite heavily in places outside of Dublin. Galway is like super hot at the moment as well. So we are actually seeing that. I think the investment nationally in broadband infrastructure, I think will clearly help that.
And I think what we've seen Stripe do really, really well is have customers in new locations requesting for Stripe to operate in them countries. Is there a way that you've seen work, Liz or Brian, in terms of startups generating interest in new locations and getting your processes set up so that you can decide, this is where I'm going to go next?
Well, if I could suggest, it is quite important for startups sometimes when you win a big account, like we've won a number of big accounts, but we often find account expansion is critical to revenue growth, because what happens is the first company that you win, let's say it's DHL in Ireland that we talked to and we won them, but they recommended us now to other DHLs across the world. And so we're now in conversation with all of them. So that is important. But again, we had to localize our product for the markets that we're chasing. So certain markets I would say no to, like Russia and China, just no at the moment. But other markets, it's wide open, and we would absolutely go for that. I think in terms of remote working, I would say to startups is when you're an established corporate, that's easier to do remote working because they have the funds and they have the operational structure. When you're a startup and you're developing your product and doing product market fit and you're winning your first customers, having your salespeople close to you in the office is critical because you're hearing that feedback firsthand and you're feeding that back to the technologists. So hybrid working is always a really good place to be where the sales guys are in the office sometimes and they're working from home some days. But having it all salespeople working remotely, especially in the startup phase, it's a lot tougher because your product is innovating at pace. You have to hear firsthand what the customers are saying or what they don't want. The technologists need to hear those messages. And, remote working exclusively in sales, I have some of my salespeople have even said they want to be back in the office. They just found it was like a zoo living at home where they were sharing a house with 5 other people and they were sitting in the kitchen and they couldn't do their Zoom calls because people were popping into them. So I think we just have to be mindful at the stage of a company is at for remote working. And we have to be mindful of the type of home they're living in. If the household is rental versus private and they have a lovely bedroom to do it in. We did have one company that we work with and they asked us to have one of their employees work in our office, remote working, because he was 6'4" and his bedroom was probably 6 foot by 10 foot. And he couldn't work at home. So there is a lot there that we need to support our salespeople in. And I just would say be mindful of the stage of the company, mindful of where your product development is at, and keep your salespeople close to you because all the learnings you're hearing from them are helping to shape your product for the customers. That's just a thought. What do you think,
And
Brian?
Tyler?
Thanks, Liz. Well, I totally agree. I mean, I think one of the features of the pandemic has been that, if you like, the pain, as always in these scenarios, is very unequally spread, and I think we've all suffered, but I think of people who were trying to, work from home in a small apartment while, wrangling 3 small children kind of thing. And I'm very grateful that I don't have to do that. And I think it's very important that leaders in companies are thinking about these things and are looking to take account of these things in terms of the way that they manage the business and in terms of the way that they manage the return to work. So I completely agree. The other thing that both Liz and Mark mentioned was the value of having customers kind of pull you into a new market. And Liz mentioned DHL and how they've introduced Liz's business to other DHL franchises, for want of a better word. And we had very, very similar experience in Clavis, Gary Moroney's company, where Unilever really wanted us to be in China, and that meant we went to China and ended up building an operation there with quite a number of people and quite a few other customers. And I think that's particularly valuable with larger scale enterprise sales, less so with a product driven strategy with a kind of a lower price point. More generally, I think I like to see companies taking, if you like, a thoughtful approach to new market entry, where they're not just going to Germany because somebody in Germany wants them, but they're actually thinking through what is the list of new market opportunities that we could potentially pursue. And as Mark mentioned, a new market isn't necessarily a new geography. It might be a new customer segment. I mean, today we might be serving primarily small businesses, and we might be asking the question whether we should move up to larger enterprises. That could be a new market. Similarly, we might be mainly focused on financial services. And the question is, should we be moving into the manufacturing industry space? So don't just think of a new market as being a country. And then sit down and think through the implications of each of the different markets that are potential new opportunities. Think through how many customers are in that market. Think through the regulatory barriers, as Mark mentioned. Think through what you might need to do to your product to make it acceptable in that new market. Maybe you need to localize it. Maybe you actually need to change the product reasonably significantly, and that has a cost, So I just like to see companies actually thinking through why a new market is, if you like, the best new market for them to go to.
Brilliant. And to all our viewers, feel free to pop in a question into the Q&A section on Zoom, and we'll make sure to ask any of our speakers the questions. And touching on a lot of that, both Liz and Brian mentioned kind of the policy and regulatory environment. How important is that in a startup's plan of action in terms of how they expand? In terms of Stripe even, how difficult has it been, and what can be done to improve the policy environment, maybe at an EU level?
I think it's not a question that's unique to Stripe or a company of our stage. I think it's policy in our region is an ever-present topic and consideration for businesses of all sizes. I think it's exciting now to see Scale Ireland launched yesterday the initiative backing the package from the EU Commission around looking at talent and looking at ecosystem and looking at policy, things that should be addressed in order to stimulate, more demand. And so I think the short answer to how important is it? The short answer is it's very important. I think the question really is what aspects of policy, again, depending on the stage of business that you're at, what aspects of policy should you really be concerned about right now? For some, it might be, let's say you have a HQ in Ireland. For some, it might be attracting talent to Ireland. Maybe you're operating in a kind of multinational scenario. You've got customers everywhere, but you want to serve them from one particular base. There are kind of regulatory and policy challenges around how you do that, how you bring talent into the country, how you make that talent, or not make that talent, that sounds very stick, how you make it attractive for that talent to be here as well. So things like tax policy or policy around equity even, those are considerations for businesses, of all sizes, but particularly for startups. And I think, again, it is probably, Brian and Liz both mentioned this as well, between regulation and your ability to change or adapt your product to a market. Those are probably the two key friction points, I think, to going anywhere.
Yeah, I think as a founder, it can be difficult to navigate all the different ecosystems and learn the ins and outs of how to operate in each different jurisdiction. Yeah. So perhaps a bit of standardization would be great. Someone has asked advice on if they're joining a startup that has excellent potential, but has not developed a thorough strategy. What advice would you give? So it's a tricky old question,
but it's a tough one without exact context on exactly what's going on there. I think I would quantify in some way what is high potential, and I think also really think about what are your needs. Like for example, some people might. The need is an existential one. I need to be certain that this business will still be a business a year from now because, I have a family to support or whatever, or mortgage to pay, something like that. If that's not important to you, then, the kind of the opportunity becomes wider. So I think start with what's important to you. What are the things you need to be able to get, back from the opportunity? And then, equally important, what are you bringing to that opportunity? What can you can do to make the potential of that business even greater. There are specifics that are not clear in the outline here, but there are specifics around what role will you play in scaling the organization? What part will you play, or what will the business, I suppose, demand of you in scaling that operation as well? And if those opportunities are interesting, go for it. But I think about the reasons, again, that are core to you. What do I need from an opportunity, and does this business present that?
Brilliant. Yeah, that sounds brilliant. And thanks very much, everyone, for coming on to today's webinar, especially to Mark for giving his time to lend his expertise. It's been really brilliant. And likewise to Brian and Liz, it's been fantastic having a panel discussion with both of you. Your expertise has been just invaluable to early stage founders like myself.